Um, Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tobias Oker, and I'm an advisor in Kern County. I'm very happy to have you guys again at yet again our water program webinar. Our speaker today is Professor Mike Loik, who is a professor of environmental studies and an agronomist at the new agriculture experiment station at UC Santa Cruz. The title of his talk today is Rain, Snow, and Fog in California. Uh, Professor Loik, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And yeah, the floor is all yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Tobias. I appreciate the invitation and happy to be here. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. And I'll try and move quickly and end before time for some questions, and so everybody can get back to the women's Final Four today. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of my experiences working on plant productivity in different aspects of California and California agriculture in particular. I'm going to use this iconography to talk about 4 different aspects of my past, recent, and ongoing research. In the upper left, I'll talk about productivity and snow in grazed shrubland in Eastern California. And I will also next talk about drought and productivity in grazed grasslands in coastal California. In the lower left, I will talk about strawberry productivity under fog and clouds in coastal agriculture in the Salinas Valley near the Pacific coast, and then finish up talking about measuring and monitoring water in controlled environment agriculture. Okay, so we all know California is a fascinating and diverse place. It's got a diversity of topography and soils and climate patterns over long periods of time and weather situations on shorter time scales. And so this combines into an incredible amount of biological and ecological diversity, but it also provides a diversity of challenges to land managers and to agronomists and to growers and farmers throughout the state. So in this image, we see average annual precipitation in California, and we see a beautiful example of this diversity with lots of precipitation in the higher elevations of the Sierra and in the northern part of the state. We see the big bathtub of the Central Valley. We see the deserts of the southeast and the eastern part of the state. And if we look down just across the border from Yuma, Arizona, the average there is about 3 or 4% of what the average way up in Eureka is like. So just a tremendous variability of conditions in California related to precipitation. So some of this is related to larger scale factors that bring rain, snow, and fog to California, such as the patterns of the jet stream in the winter that bring cold winter type weather from the Gulf of Alaska. And as we know nowadays that these systems in ocean currents interact with the tropical waters and can result in warmer waters being entrained into atmospheric rivers that deluge California at times. For certain parts of the state, the summer monsoon is important for bringing rainfall, particularly our eastern deserts. And then along the coast, we have seasonal summer, largely summer coastal fog and stratus, that is fog that's a little bit higher and not actually foggy at the deck. And then at the higher elevations of the state, we see rain that arrives as snow. And that, of course, is incredibly important for California agriculture because that's our major water storage towers. And as that melts and runs off into the various water storage systems and conveyance of California, that's then delivered to cities and to the agricultural regions throughout the state. So I probably for this audience don't need to go through this slide, but let's do it anyways, just as a quick reminder. So water is incredibly important at multiple scales, and I remind my students about this all the time. It's the medium of chemical reactions, but it's not just a bathtub in which other things happen. Water actually pulls apart in photosynthesis and comes back together again during respiration. But water is really important for heat regulation of organisms, both cold and warm-blooded, as well as the effects of the surroundings. The structure of organisms is determined in large part by water, and transport of materials within cells and individuals is also reliant on water. And the immediate environment, that is the availability of water, is, of course, ultimately influential for the distribution and productivity survival of organisms. The ability to deal with solutes in the water is incredibly important, especially in certain kinds of agriculture and certain kinds of environments. And then for growth of plants, of course, you need water for them to grow, to expand, to make new cells, to do photosynthesis, to make new organs. Now that growth, when we scale up to larger communities and ecosystems, we measure that as productivity, but water in ecosystems is also important for nutrient cycling, geographic distribution of organisms, and of course the seasonality of that water is one of the things that we really face here in California. Okay, so let me tell you to start off about some experiences with water in the frozen phase. Notice all of these are different phases of water. So I'll talk about the work we've done for over, well, almost 25 years now in Eastern California at one of the UC ANR Natural Reserve System sites, Valentine Eastern Sierra Reserve. So this is near Mammoth Lakes. And we're looking at this image here. We're looking toward the Sierra from the east. Behind us is the rest of the Great Basin Desert, all the way past Salt Lake City and to the western slope of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and other states around there. So the two shrub species that we see here, there's kind of a light green one and a dark green one, and we'll see their names in a little bit. You might be familiar with them, but they're arguably some of the most widely distributed species, shrub species in our country. One of those is sagebrush, and so this is a kind of habitat that is broadly and widely used for grazing throughout the U.S. and southern Canada, for that matter. And so for a number of years, we monitored the amount of snowfall at this site and how plants would photosynthesize after that. And we assumed that with more snow, there'd be more water in the soil, more water uptake, more growth, more leaves, more flowers, fruits, and seeds. And so we were interested in how sensitive the system was to variability in snowfall. And here we just have a progression of images from June 2011, and the star shows the location of where this work was conducted, through the major drought of the period from June 2012 to roughly 2016. And we can see that those darker regions corresponding to the driest parts of the state. In June 2017, we had a rather wet winter that was close to repeated again in 2019. Notice this graphic only goes to 2020, but we continued monitoring up till COVID. Everything shut down, so we missed out on 2020 and 2021. We were back at it in 22, and then in 2023, you might recall that was a humongous rain and snowfall year with like 50 feet of snow in Mammoth Lakes. And that was the last year of our measurements for this work. So here's a depiction of what the variability of long-term snowfall for roughly the past 100 years, not quite 100 years. So many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with William Mulholland and how the water from the Owens Valley was taken from farmers and transported through the aqueduct to the city of Los Angeles and supported the development of the city there. So the history of snowfall has been recorded for since 1928, every April 1st since 1928. And nowadays they actually do March, April, May, June 1st. And some of these measurements are automated now. But this is the snow course near Mammoth, or in Mammoth Pass near Mammoth Lakes. It's about 15 kilometers or so from the study site that I'll show the results from here. Anyways, what we can see is a tremendous amount of variability. And this is one of the things that I think that, everybody recognizes, that there are wet years, there are dry years, there are almost no normal years. We see that the mean at this site is 136 centimeters of snowfall, with about half of that, the coefficient of variability representing about half of that. So you can see that several years have been over 2 standard deviations. Some of you might remember 1983 was a very wet and impactful year in California. We've had some more years like that. We also, in this graphic, you can see roughly 14 years that are more than 1 standard deviation below the mean. And then 2015 right here is the only year in which April 1st, there was no snow on the ground in Mammoth Pass when that measurement was made. Now, if I had updated this graph to include 2023, it would have gone through the roof and would have shrunken all of this detail down. In any case, there's that graph again up at the top. If we take all of those years and categorize them according to the depth of snow, we see what the frequency distribution of the different amounts of snowfall are. So the mean is about 136, as I said, but we note it's the distribution slightly skewed to the dry side of that. Then the bottom graph is if you take all of the 14 years that are less than 60 centimeters of snow and below that -1 standard deviation, and look at the depths on those years, 1 and 2 years later are often wetter years. So these droughts are often 1 year, not always, as we know. But we see that 14 of those 92 years had less than 60 centimeters. And there's that 2015 data point right there. So a lot of variability. And so how do plants contend with that? How do they deal with that? And so we were interested in simulating snow precipitation change, and we had for a year or two had tried some things like using snow blowers and shovels and all kinds of different things to try and manipulate snow. And you can push snow, you can shovel snow, blow snow away from research plots, but inevitably that snow will melt and kind of soak in from the sides. And so one day I realized that Caltrans had built a bunch of snow fences around the Mammoth Lakes area, which were doing the job for us of manipulating snow. And snow fences, you may have seen these. They're common all over the country in snowy places to prevent snow from blowing across roads or rail lines or other places. Sometimes ski areas use them to build up snow where they actually want snow. And so we were able to use a series of these snow fences to create both an increase and a slight decrease in snow depth on an experimental basis. And the nice thing about that was that these fences were built originally in the 1950s. They'd been moved a couple of times, but the ones that you see in this photo here have been there since 1986. So roughly 40-ish years of treatment year in and year out. And what's nice about it is, I'll show you on the next slide this cartoon diagram. So we here have this cartoon snow fence, and we're looking at an oblique angle here. And typically in the wintertime, the prevailing wind comes from the west or the northwest, somewhere around that, and it's often laminar and blowing snow in layers across the landscape. That is until they hit the snow fence, and the spaces in the snow fence cause the wind to slow down. The wind becomes turbulent, and it slows up, and the snowflakes drop out of the wind and create an equilibrium drift, which here we've labeled as an increased snow depth location. Further downwind, there's decreased snow depth, because all of this snow that you're not allowing to blow across Highway 395 is built up in this drift. And that drift is in the same place every year. And what changes from year to year is the height and the volume of snow in the drift. So for 40-ish years, these snow fences have been creating more or less snow on the downwind side. And then we would go 50 meters upwind and we created a bunch of ambient snow depth plots. And the idea here was that, well, more snow, more water when it melts, it soaks in, plants take it up, they'll be happier, they'll do more photosynthesis, there'll be more plants on the landscape for animals to graze or to otherwise utilize. And we spent 20 years measuring all kinds of things, recruitment and photosynthesis and water relations and carbon in the soil and nitrogen and all kinds of things like that. What I'm just going to show you one outcome, though, of much of this long-term work. Here's an image of what the snow fence looks like. This is in 2005, I believe, which was quite a snowy year. So this is what it would have looked like in 2023. I think the snow in 2023, in fact, was up above the fences. These are our two main characters at this site. Sagebrush, Artemisia tridentata over on the right, which is known for being deeply rooted and it pulls water up from deeper depths. And Persia tridentata, which often grows in the same places, the same kinds of habitats. It's in the Rosaceae. We know a lot less about the physiology of that species. We do know, though, it has a sort of basic form of nitrogen fixation with actinomycetes. It's also deeply rooted shrub species. And you'll see in the background some conifers, and we've done some work with conifers. You look in the foreground, you see a lot of bare ground and not a lot of grasses or other kinds of herbaceous or forb species. And so this site has a species richness of about 12, so it's very simple to understand and to work with. And we've done a lot of work with the conifers and with the grasses and the forbs. I won't have a lot of time to tell you about that today, however. So this is the one result I wanted to show from this work. We're going out there every year in June and measuring photosynthesis after the snowmelt period. And what we're looking at here, I should point out, first of all, on the left-hand side, let's focus on the left to begin with. In the upper panel is sagebrush. In the lower panel is the antelope bitterbrush, Persia. And in these graphs, we're looking at the above ground net primary productivity, how much growth occurred in these years. So 2011 was the last wet year before that big drought of the mid-teens, 20 teens. And so we see here that after 2011 and 2012, we see about a 90-ish% drop in productivity that started to slowly bounce back through the drought. And then by 2016, even though the rain and snow was not back to a point where we as a society thought that the drought was over, you can see that it was enough for photosynthesis and productivity to start to creep back up again. And then in 2017, we see amounts of growth that were roughly the same as that 2011 period. So we see a big drop and a recovery. 2018, 2019, we see a little dip, bounces back up. And I'm going to ignore the 2023 stuff for now because it's just so far out there. So now if we take these data, and I should have pointed out, sorry, red, blue, and black are the results from the ambient snow depth plots upwind of the snow fences. You can see the snow fence in the image behind me. The plus snow plots are 13 meters downwind of those fences. And then the minus snow plots, they are 70 meters downwind of the fence. We could have gone further, but then you start getting close to the road and the plows on the road start to throw snow onto the ground if you get too close to the road. So we had to sort of decide where to put those plots, and they actually result in a 20% decrease in the amount of snow, whereas the plus snow plots basically double the ambient snow depth. If we take those data on the left-hand side and redraw them in terms of the annual precipitation in the years for each of those measurements, then we get these kinds of responses, which I find quite interesting, akin to a CO2 or light response curve. This is like an ecosystem precipitation response curve. And we see that from up to annual precipitation of about 500 millimeters, we don't see a whole lot of productivity for either species. But after 500 millimeters, then we see a fairly abrupt response for both species that seems to saturate, although, of course, you may have already noticed this, most of that saturation is based on the numbers in 2017 and 2018 kind of drive that whole saturation part of the curve. In any case, this is the first time that I'm aware of that anybody has shown the productivity responses across 20-ish years of data. Or sorry, 10 years in this case. We have 20-ish years. Okay, so some takeaway points from this work. Both shrub species are incredibly resilient to both the historic drought, very dry years, followed by very wet years. They were able to track that quite readily. And this is likely related to the, and I say resilient because they track it, but the shrubs didn't die. You know, even in the driest drought in 1200 years or something like that, everybody lived. They all bounced back. And we suspect that this may have something to do with their deep roots. And of course, the deep roots are important for carbon storage. So there's another aspect to all of this. The response is likely constrained by temperature, too cold in the winter, too hot and dry in the summer. They have this window for growth of a couple of months. And then one question that this doesn't really address is how will snow to rain shifts affect this system? If that same water is arriving as rain instead of snow, will the plants be as productive? And so we'll leave that as an important question and then shift over to drought in coastal grazed systems. And so this work was done in conjunction with the International Drought Experiment. And this work was done at the UC Natural Reserve Younger Lagoon here on our campus. It's one of the smaller reserves, but right on the coast. We had a series of 3 sites where we built these rainout shelters, as you can see in this image. And we were part of this international drought experiment, which is part of a group called DroughtNet, this network. And there were these shelter experiments that were built throughout the world, over 100 of them. So it's a globally coordinated experiment. It was supported by the NSF as a research coordination network. And you can see here, perhaps not surprisingly, a large number of sites in the United States and Europe. There's a person in South America who did a great job to get a lot of sites established down there. A number of sites, a large number in China, some in Australia, and of course, not enough in places like Africa and Southeast Asia. So in any case, we had 100 sites that went into an analysis. They used shelters, rainout shelters like this one. This is our site in Santa Cruz. You can see how dry it gets in the summertime. This was in this would have been 2018. This photo was taken. And so so the network created a protocol that was a 1 meter by 1 meter shelter that could be built for a relatively inexpensive amount of money so that it could be accessible to people everywhere. We decided to build bigger shelters at our site and do more things with them. We have a 2 meter by 2 meter square of research plot underneath this shelter and a 1 meter buffer all the way around the shelter. The spacing of the troughs on the top determines how much water is taken off of the plots. And the network had an algorithm for determining a 1 in 100 year drought for each site, which at our site, if we removed 60% of the rainfall, then that would correspond to a 1 in 100 year drought. Each site was able to measure whatever they wanted, but they had to agree to measure above ground net primary productivity and plant diversity in separate plots each year, so not resampling the same plots. You can see in this image, we have metal frames. That was the original construction. And the prior image was after the metal frames failed in a big storm. What else to say? Okay, so there were over 100 sites in this network. 100 data from 100 of those sites were used that had the proper timing, were used in a paper that came out a few months ago. Melinda Smith was the lead author. She is the person who organizes the network. And on the right-hand side, you can see the 100 sites arranged from most to least responsive, with some, it's actually from most negative to most positively responding sites. Our Santa Cruz sites are kind of up near the top, but we notice that many sites are not responsive at all. So the 0 dashed line means that the drought impacted. So this is above ground net primary productivity again. So many sites were quite resilient to a 1 in 100 year drought. Some of the wettest sites actually had higher productivity because of the deleterious effects of too much water at times. And then we see a number of sites that had a large drought response. Most of the sites in the network were either grasslands or shrublands, with about 2/3 of, about 3/4 of them being grasslands, because it's just easier to build these things and duck under them and measure grasses. And the sites fell out along kind of two groupings, which is places where the experimental drought was like out of the ordinary, and extreme is what we labeled this. And then in other places where the 1 in 100 year drought was not that out of the ordinary, and it was something that the sites might have recently experienced in their recent history. And so you can see that grasslands and shrublands behave differently in terms of extreme versus nominal drought. And co-occurring with some of these controls were the effects of mean annual precipitation, panel A, the aridity index, panel D, and species richness, panel G. But notice that these results were unaffected by the coefficient of variation of mean annual rainfall, the variability. Previous year's precipitation didn't have an effect. The amount of sand in the soil and the drainage that results, and the amount of grasses in the communities. None of those things had an impact. So some takeaway points from this experiment. A large portion of the sites were resilient to extreme drought, and this is in terms of growth only. The response depends on whether it's extreme or nominal. Again, it might be related to the depth of roots and where they are seeing or not the drying effect. The response was constrained by MAP, aridity, and species richness. And then the main finding here was that most models and some recent studies have underestimated the global response of ecosystems to extreme 1 year drought. Now you may be saying, what about the diversity impacts? And those are currently, a revision is under review at Science based on those data. Okay, so now let's shift our attention to coastal fog and clouds, right? And how do fog and clouds affect strawberry production along the coast here in California? So I had a postdoc named Sarah Baguskis, who's a faculty member at San Francisco State now. And when she was a postdoc with me, she was driving up from Santa Barbara. And one day she was driving through Salinas, and it was a cloudy day on the verge of rain. And all the sprinklers were, this is not a picture of that day, but close enough. All the sprinklers were running on a cloudy day when it was just about to rain. And Sarah was thinking, like, why would they do this? Why would they not pay attention to whether it was foggy or cloudy and adjust the irrigation according to that? And so she wrote a USDA postdoc proposal, and it got funded to to work on this question of strawberry photosynthesis and the influence of fog and clouds. And we published 2 papers, and the first showed a really important impact of fog that had been that hadn't been properly quantified. And this is the downwelling long wave radiation given off by fog and clouds. And so water makes up fog and clouds, and water has mass and can absorb heat and re-radiate heat like all objects in the universe above 0 Kelvin. And so we set up eddy covariance systems that I'll show you in another image in a moment. You can see that in the inset images, these weather station-like, and they're on the edge of strawberry fields close to the ocean, and then another set near inland on the other side of Salinas, and looking at the impacts of coastal fog on strawberry photosynthesis. And we can see here that on a cloudy day, that the frequency of measurements of downward long wave radiation, that is heat given off by the clouds, is much higher, much more frequent heat radiation on those cloudy days. And some of you may have experienced this or noticed this or be aware of this. Cloudy nights are warmer than foggy nights, cloudy nights are warmer than clear nights. But one of the other things that we found was really quite interesting. And so we have to take a little aside here and think about the response of photosynthesis to sunlight. And now everybody knows that plants need sun, but perhaps not everybody knows that the response is characteristically nonlinear. And that's what we're showing here in this graphic. On the x-axis is light intensity from darkness to full sun. And on the y-axis is photosynthesis of an individual leaf. And we've got 2 plots here for leaves that were, say, grown at the top of a tree exposed to full sun, and leaves inside the canopy of the tree exposed to shade. They develop and operate different from one another. And we can see that one of those ways is in their response to photosynthesis to light intensity. Now, interestingly, much of the action happens at light levels just above darkness. So photosynthesis is increasing as the light levels increase, and this happens fairly rapidly, up to about 1/4 of full sunlight. And so this is something that I think people are not always aware of, which is that plants don't need full sun in order to grow to their full capacity. And in fact, they can get a form of plant damage, photoinhibition, if for certain species, if they're grown in full sun. Okay, and I think just have a little dash line here to show you after about 1/4 of full sun in this example, the photosynthetic response is leveling off. And you might be wondering, as an aside, what about the shading from those drought shelters? And it turns out that the amount of shade was inconsequential in terms of this kind of a response. So the question remains, how does fog and its effects on light intensity, by comparison to its effects on water in the atmosphere, where when it's foggy, the atmospheric relative humidity is quite high, and the water potential of the atmosphere is relatively benign in foggy conditions compared to sunny full sun conditions. So we used eddy covariance to ask questions about the light and water responses of this strawberry field. This is at the Driscoll's facility near Watsonville. And this rig is basically a very fancy weather station. It has all of the kinds of things that you would normally see on a weather station alongside an interstate here in California. But it has a couple of important additional sensors. And they're shown right here. And these measure carbon dioxide concentration and water vapor. And they measure also wind speed and direction from basically an infinite number of directions. And those are those 2 sensors right here. And what they allow us to do is to measure the water that's released by the by the strawberry field. They're able to allow us to measure the carbon dioxide that is taken up by the strawberry field during the daytime. And Driscoll's interest here was in terms of how much carbon could they store in their strawberry fields. And so we've set these up in a couple different locations, but one of the interesting patterns that Sarah found in her postdoctoral work is shown here. We have two graphs. I'm going to point you to the one on the right to begin with. And this graph is somewhat like that light response we looked at for the sun and shade leaf a moment ago. Instead of sun and shade, we have gray dots and yellow dots, and those are fog and sun. So gray for fog, yellow for orange for sun. And so on the x-axis is light intensity, again, going from darkness at 0 to full sun at 2000. And on the y-axis is strawberry field photosynthesis, or the amount of carbon dioxide going into the field at any point in time. And we see a solid line and a dashed line. And so the carbon dioxide uptake in this strawberry field is actually higher on a cloudy day than on a sunny day. And that might be a little bit backwards to what a lot of people think, which is that, well, on a sunny day, it should be wide open because you have all this light driving photosynthesis. But when you open stomata to take up CO2, you lose water. So plants have this conundrum, this pro and con situation of regulating their water loss in terms of carbon dioxide uptake. Nevertheless, we see that photosynthesis is actually higher by maybe 20% per light unit on a foggy day compared to a clear day. And similarly, in terms of the water use, we see on the left-hand panel, we have evapotranspiration. That's the water leaving both the soil surface and the leaf surface, and how that affects the strawberry field photosynthesis. And again, we see a pronounced difference between the pattern on foggy days compared to non-foggy days. Okay, so strawberry canopy carbon uptake was higher on foggy or cloudy days than clear sky days. And now why might this be? And so we think it has to do with the scattered light on foggy, cloudy days, that the light coming through the clouds bounces off particles. And so you get that very scattered white light that tends to irradiate more chloroplasts per leaf than by compared to a full sun day. So on a sunny day, you have a bright speck in the sky, and basically all of the photons are traveling in parallel lines, and they are exciting chlorophyll molecules in chloroplasts in leaves that have the right orientation. On a cloudy day, the light is scattered and the photons are coming from multiple directions, and they are then exciting chlorophyll molecules in chloroplasts at a wider variety of angles. And so you are more efficiently exciting chlorophyll on cloudy days than on clear sky days. Now, what does this mean? Well, perhaps we can irrigate less on foggy, cloudy days because the plants are able to do photosynthesis just fine at those times, at least for these strawberries in these coastal systems. Your results may vary with other crops in other places. All right, let's see how I'm doing on the time. Not too bad, I think. Okay, so now we're down to the most recent work of these projects, which is in controlled environment agriculture. And I'll tell you about one part of the work that we're doing in this realm today, which is a fleet of greenhouse drones for monitoring and managing crops that we call Track Drone. And Track Drone was inspired by conversations with a company called Ag Eagle. Some of you may know them. They build this sensor in this image that gets strapped to drones and flown at 100 or more feet up in the air to assess the health of farm fields and whether there's irrigation issues or fertilizer issues or pest or pathogen issues. So this company came to me and with the looking to expand their market to CEA and greenhouse grown products and said, how would you use one of these in a greenhouse since the drone is about a meter across and there's too much infrastructure in the roof of the glass house? How would you do this? And I'd already been thinking about how I would do a track-based monitoring system, and so it was just a matter of modifying that to include the sensor here. This is a 5-channel camera that is looking at the leaves growing on the benches below. This is about 2 meters above the plants, and it with the lenses, it's able to look at red, green, and blue, as well as infrared and what's called the red edge, which adjusts somewhat when plants are stressed. And so the red, green, blue allows us to look at plants and to determine things like normalized difference vegetation index and DVI, which is a sense of the greenness of the plants. If there are pests or pathogens that are affecting the greenness, then this camera will call that out. And it travels around on a track. It's a big U-shaped track. This is not what the drone looks like anymore, but because of intellectual property reasons, I wasn't able to show you. They've evolved quite a bit. We've built 4 different payloads, I think we're at right now. One of them is we started off with with a bulky FLIR infrared web-enabled camera that we were using to measure leaf temperatures, but we just recently moved on to these smaller FLIR Pro Edge Pro cameras. And here's a little demonstration on the left where some cover crop leaves that I took an image of over this past weekend. And they came out to 17 Celsius in that purple label there. The yellow is the soil underneath the plant, and the purple are the leaves. And I watered the plants and came back half an hour later, took another image, and the leaves had cooled down because they were wetter and stomata had opened, and they were transmitting the heat of vaporization that happens when a water molecule goes from the liquid to vapor phase at the thin film of water on the cell wall surface, the site of evaporation within leaves. So that heat transfer results in slightly cooler leaves, which in many species you can actually tell just by touching them. Droughted leaves are warmer than watered leaves. And so our goal now is to couple imagery with machine learning models to help us determine which plants in a greenhouse need a little drink of water. And so we can ask the plants if they need a drink of water rather than asking the soils if the plants need a drink of water, which is the way that some of us have been doing it for quite some time now. Okay, so what are some takeaway points here? One, I should point out that the track drone, the tracks, the robots, all 4 robots, all of that have been built only since July of last year. Our drones currently can operate in a continuous back and forth mode, or they can travel like 50 centimeters, stop, take a picture, then move another 50 centimeters, stop, take a picture. We are currently benchmarking drought and pest responses that we could take pictures with the camera and then do additional measurements with leaf reflectance or photosynthesis with LICOR, water relations and things like that. So we're doing those kinds of measurements now. And Ag Eagle, maybe they don't want me telling you this, but they've got a new sensor coming out in a few months that is geared towards plant pathogens. So as I mentioned, we've built 4 payloads, one of which includes that fancy Ag Eagle multi-channel camera. The other being the infrared camera from FLIR that I showed you. We have one that carries a cell phone over top of the plants. And in the cell phone, we have an app called Pidial Pro, which measures greenness and leaf area and a variety of other leaf parameters. And there's some species-specific programs. If you're not familiar with that program, it's kind of cool because you can install it. It's only an Android program, but you can put it on a tablet. And you can have students measure things that were quite objective in the past. We have a fourth payload, which is UVC to kill pests and pathogens. And so we are working that one up right now. That one will operate in a continuous mode at nighttime when there are no staff around. There will be fans that will help to blow the leaves to help ensure exposure to UVC. Okay, well, a few concluding thoughts here. Those are the four projects that I wanted to touch on. I think nobody here will be surprised by the fact that access to water will continue to be a major challenge for agriculture in California. It's because we have climate change and we have regulatory issues like SGMA, for example, that will determine or help to determine how much water is available for irrigation. Likewise, so those regulatory measures like SGMA, as well as the nitrogen regulations, will mean tighter adaptation of water use. And I think that there will be digital tools that can help bridge that gap. But at the same time, those will have to be used alongside. There are well understood methods for understanding how plants contend with drought or too much water in the future. So with that, I want to say thanks for listening. And of course, I should point out that there were piles and piles of people who helped to make all of this happen and or who helped to fund it. So thanks a lot. And I think we have some time for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Loik. The meeting is open to questions. If you have a question, please go ahead and ask. Well, I'll go first then. I have a question. Oh yeah, currently, how is a crop water requirement determined in greenhouse settings?
I think it depends a lot on the greenhouse. And so one thing that's kind of interesting with this track drone, these robots, I was participating very recently in an NSF customer discovery program. And so I surveyed a number of growers and what I thought was going to be a very, well, I'm not sure how to put this. I thought the results I got were way different from what I thought. So first of all, one of the really big surprises that the greenhouse industry, there is no greenhouse industry. The greenhouse industry is really the industry that builds greenhouses. The growers, there's a lot of categories, right? There's the vegetable people, there's houseplant people, there's landscaping nurseries, there's cannabis, there's cacti and succulents, and so all of these different kinds of greenhouse users have different needs. And so for some of them, their main challenges are in things like inventory control and getting plants out the door, and watering plants and plant diseases they're not even really their concern. They just grow stuff and they ship them out the door. And that's not everybody. That was just some of them. Then there are some places where they really are quite concerned about like the health of the plants. And I think that this is a long-winded way to say that there's a wide variety of how people monitor the water in plants in greenhouses. And a lot of them put their finger in the soil or in the rock wool. A lot of them do it based on timing. Today's a watering day. A lot of them do it based on weather conditions. So you need to water because it was warmer, things like that. So and then of course there are automated systems as well with small electrical systems that either work on things like the capacitance of the soil.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, please go ahead, Anna. Oh, Jana, you can go ahead, and then we can have Ted and Eric afterwards.
Okay, thanks. That was a really interesting talk. I was curious with your the first study that you talked about. It was really interesting to see that they actually improved even though the drought was continuing. I think that was net primary product.
Oh, you're right. Yes, that was in 2016. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they were starting to grow even though the water, the rain and snow had kicked up a bit that year.
Okay. So you don't think it was any sort of like acclimation, like increased water use efficiency or
No,
no?
yeah, I don't think so. That's a good question. That's a really good question. Nobody's ever asked that over all this time. Um, we have done some experiments with water additions, and you can squeeze more photosynthesis out of them if you give them more water. So there is that potential.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Ted, you can go. Sorry, you
Thanks.
can go
Yeah.
ahead.
Great. Yeah. Great talk.
Thanks.
I had a question on the first study as well. You kind of left us with a little bit of a teaser question about how climate change and this transition from kind of the snow dominated to maybe a more rainfall dominated hydrology might affect these vegetation patterns, and kind of left us with that teaser. And just curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, one of the reasons for putting that in there is that in 2015, I mentioned that there was no snow on the ground on April 1st, but there was snow earlier that year, but there was also rain. So that was 2015 was almost like a simulation of a snow to rain year. And it turns out that the rain that did fall in the spring of that year supported, a small amount of growth. And so, it's not a good indication, but it suggests that maybe rain would support the same amount of growth. So I submitted to NSF a couple times some snow to rain proposals that didn't quite make it. Well, they didn't make it at all. But yeah, I'm really interested in that question because in some places those, especially if you get rain falling on an existing snowpack, the water vapor, the energy in the water vapor in the air causes a very rapid melting of the snow. And so you can get some pretty important flood situations. And my understanding is this is really highest risk for this is in the Cascades, where they have sort of a combination of situations with a lot of snow, steep mountains near the coast, with a lot of water vapor that can cause that kind of thing. So they're really concerned about that up there.
Thank you.
Eric, please go ahead.
Thanks, Tobias, and thanks, Michael. Great to see you again.
Hi.
A question around the work in the Central Coast with the strawberry farmers. I'm curious that in the process of sort of setting up for the experiment or implementing it, if you talk to any of the producers there about their impressions and whether this aligns with what they would kind of naturally be doing, or maybe it's all over the map and different people would have different tendencies.
Yeah, it was really interesting. That was one of the most eye-opening things, frankly, is I thought that, here we are, Salinas Valley, it's just, 80 miles or whatever from Silicon Valley. And I thought they'd all be decked out with tech and stuff for measuring soil water or turning pumps on and off. And it turns out that what they did, at least on this particular farm, and we had similar experiences elsewhere, is that the guy would drive out to the first tap in the morning and he would turn it on, and he'd drive to the next one and he'd turn that one on, and he'd drive to the next one and he'd turn that one on. And when he turned all of the pumps on or taps or whatever, he'd go back to the first one and he'd turn that one off, and then he'd turn the next one off, and he'd turn the next one off. And so there seemed to be a real kind of disconnect between sort of management on the ground and the information that was available. That was, you know, an N of 1 or 2, but I was kind of surprised about that. Hard to say. I assume that there's greater penetration of soil moisture technology, pun intended, in other places.
Thanks.
But I'm wondering if, since you asked that, if you're finding similar kinds of patterns elsewhere.
Well, it's definitely something that folks across the extension work on, like adoption of new technologies, soil moisture sensors, or our colleagues on the coast that have some joint projects with have been working on this for quite a while in the Santa Cruz, Santa Clara, Monterey areas for sure. So I think you're right that there's still lots of opportunity for adoption of these practices and technologies.
Yeah, and I think that it's also up to us to realize that, you know, there have been some major failures also with some of these kinds of technologies, IoT-based monitoring systems for the field and for greenhouses, where, you know, there's a technology that maybe somebody purchases and they've got to keep it up, and they've got to replace batteries, and they have to, you know, understand what the information provides them. And then I think one of the big problems is a lot of these companies go out of business or they get bought by somebody else, and then that technology is no longer supported. And so then somebody has a dead set of sensors, and that's not helpful.
Yeah, the last question would be, I found that graph a bit interesting where you say that there was a lot more photosynthetic activity in cloudy days. Is that an observation which has been made with any other crops again?
I don't know if somebody on this webinar knows. No, not that I know of, but it's an interesting question, because I mean, we do grow other things under the clouds here. Broccoli, lettuce, Brussels sprouts, artichokes. That's a really good question, actually. Yeah, I think that's a new student project now.
Well, thank you. I don't know. We still have about 4 minutes. If anybody has a question or comment, please, you can chime in. If that's not the case, then I would like to thank you all. First of all, thank our guest speaker today, for accepting our invitation, and for all of you for sharing your lunch hour with us here. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks for being here, everyone.
Yep. All right.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.